is divided along these three questions.
Sorry, Michelle. I only just clicked recording now. I'm
No problem
sorry.
whatsoever.
Yeah, okay, great.
So the first question I will address is what exactly is trade policy? The second question is why trade policy matters for policymakers or bureaucrats, as Benjamin has called them. And the third is why trade policy should matter or matters to non-policymakers or non-trade nerds. So if I answer these questions, I think I'll have been able to deal with with the theme of the day adequately. Quite often, and I'm not too sure, maybe I should have asked beforehand just to get a sense of who's in the room, but quite often people consider trade to be a very boring topic, a complex area, whether they're thinking about it from an economics point of view or a legal point of view. It's often considered as a difficult, boring topic. And that's why I think for any trade nerd, which I'm hoping to make everyone in the room today, they should think less of it as a complex, sophisticated, boring area, and more about something that our daily lives revolves around. And trade policy in this regard is not something that is restricted to the capitals around the world or to some people, Geneva, because that's where the headquarters of the World Trade Organization is. But it's at the core, the idea that people should be able to exchange goods or services, and these goods or services should be used for the betterment of people's lives. So, at its core, trade policy, really, to me, and I think to many other people around the world, is about making people's lives much easier. It's about the betterment of people's lives. And it's about the betterment of people's lives through the exchange of goods or services. So, at its heart, trade policy concerns itself with how the lives of ordinary citizens can be made better through the exchange of goods or services. So, if you think about it this way, you can already see how, in fact, finished the session within the first 5 minutes. And that's why it matters to you. That's why it matters to me. That's why it should matter to everyone. Because if you go to the supermarket, for example, and pick a bar of chocolate or a pack of coffee, a pack of tea, or whatever other product that can come to your mind, that's trade in action. If you buy food from a street vendor, that's trade in action, whether this street vendor is part of the formal sector or not. When you purchase a service, when, for example, you go see a doctor, or you consult a lawyer, or you go to a dentist, this is trade in action, ladies and gentlemen. And I think sometimes we fail to see or we fail to appreciate just how intertwined trade is in our lives. And I'll come to this when I answer one of the questions a bit later. But if you really think about the process by which food has gotten to your table, the process by which you're enjoying your favorite product, your favorite show, your favorite music. When this session started, I don't know if you realized, but we could hear Miracle's music in the background. But when you think about just our ordinary lives, they are intricately intertwined with trade. And so, what trade policy makers try to do and why trade policy making is important for trade policy makers, it's usually based at the foundation on the idea of comparative advantage. And I'm sure some, if not all of you, have often had this term comparative advantage, and I'll simplify it or oversimplify it. Comparative advantage, really, at its core, is the idea that countries should produce or should manufacture or export the goods or services that they are most efficient in producing or they are most efficient in exporting given their resources. So we are familiar with the idea that that countries and the world generally has some infinite or finite resources. So if you look at your country and some of the factors affecting both that are controllable and uncontrollable to your country, you're then able to determine we are much more efficient in exporting this as opposed to this. So because we are much more efficient in exporting, for example, at the top of my mind, because I come from Kenya, I'll give you tea. We are much more efficient in exporting tea. We'll specialize in producing tea and exporting tea and import everything else. But at the same time, and I hope I don't complicate your lives too much. So first is the idea of comparative advantage, that we'll specialize and export in the areas that are most efficient to us as an economy. So that means we look at the resources that we have, both finite and infinite resources, both controllable and uncontrollable factors, which I'll mention in a minute. And given those circumstances we find ourselves in, we'll then determine what is best for us to export. So for Kenya, for example, that could be tea. And then we'll import everything else. Now, so keep that idea in mind. The other idea is that as we come up with these formulas, if I can use the term formulas, we must make sure that much as we'll import everything else, we also have a good book in terms of we're not exporting too little and importing too much. Because as we've had before, balance of payments issues, that's when you hear balance of payments issues, this is what it refers to. So policymakers are really trying to find the good balance between how much do we export and how much do we import. Does it make sense for us to manufacture some things and import the rest? And what are these things that we should manufacture and export? And what are the things that, for example, we can import because it makes no sense to do that here? Can be able to exchange goods based off I think behind this idea and why it's so important. So this session is being recorded, so I can't be as open and controversial, but I'll give you just a few thoughts for you to consider. A minister, this is a practical story, a minister on national television says, I won't tell you from which country, but you can guess, that country X, for example, needs to industrialize much more. And I'll get into this idea of industrialization in a few minutes, but needs to industrialize much more. It needs to protect infant industries so that it can be able to export much more than it imports. And he says it's very ridiculous that there are some things that country X is importing that it should not import, and goes ahead to give the example of toothpicks. So in his view, country X should not be importing toothpicks. And country X should industrialize to the point that some of these, Miracle says she's here for the controversy, but some of these goods can be manufactured at the domestic level and need not be imported. At the same time, so that's the Minister of Trade. At the same time, a few months later, the president, again on national television, says that country X has limited energy. And so it needs to get into load shedding. And this limited energy means that given the number of industry needs that are available, and given the amount of energy, the energy intensity of industries, then to meet the demand, there needs to be load shedding. So already, if you're following this example, you can see that on the one hand, the minister is saying, let's industrialize, and let's industrialize so much so that some of these things we should not be importing, like toothpicks. On the other hand, the president is saying, we don't have enough energy, and because we have limited energy and our industries need this energy, we should get into load shedding. So at the core of this, you should expect the Minister of Trade to be saying, let's concentrate our industries on the areas that we have a comparative advantage. So, for example, if we have a comparative advantage in the automotive industry, for example, let's concentrate our energy in this, rather than diversifying our energy across everything else, and, for example, getting into the manufacture of toothpicks. You're all familiar with toothpicks. They are heavy in terms of their volume, but in terms of their value, it might not be as much despite the amount of energy that will go into the production of toothpicks. So if you weigh and balance this example and consider it critically, as a trade policy maker at the heart of it is concerned with just getting the right balance and understanding the idea that you don't need as a country to produce everything under the sun. You just need to invest your energies in those comparative advantages that you have, so that the energy that you have, for example, in this country X that has limited energy, is invested in areas where you have comparative advantage, and you can get your toothpicks from the oft-quoted example, China. But let's get into this idea of comparative advantage a bit more, then we get into industrialization. Because it's simplistic to just say, look at your comparative advantage and exploit that. The reason why sometimes it's not so simplistic, and especially for African countries, is this. If you consider what countries are looking to export and the idea that they're looking to import everything else that they're not exporting to deal with their balance of payments issues, already one idea that should come into your mind, or a term that should come into your mind, is value addition. Value addition is really where the money is. So it's the idea that you're not going to be exporting raw materials. You're going to convert that raw material into something more valuable and export that valuable good or service and get more income from that. So a practical example at hand. If, for example, you are a country that has avocados and you have a great avocado production, the idea behind value addition and value creation is that don't export these avocados just raw and then import avocado oil into your market. Try as much as possible. For example, if the avocado is going to be converted into something else, try as much as possible to create value of the avocado plant by turning that into the oil and then exporting the oil. Rather than exporting the avocado to another country, that country turns it into oil and sells you as something much more valuable. The same consideration can be given to olives. The same consideration can be given to raw hides and skins. Don't export your raw hides and skins and then import leather. Try as much as possible to give more value at home. And that's really usually where the money is, because if you consider the price of, for example, raw hides and skin versus the price of a leather bag, anyone who's bought a quality leather bag or seen it in the market, already you know that the price is really quite high, quite significant. So it makes more sense to have more value added and then you export that. The other reason why it makes more sense is because through value creation and value addition, you increase the number of jobs in the market. So think about either avocado oil or raw hides and skin. There is the farmer who is planting these avocados. Usually, especially in Africa, sometimes this is small-scale farmers. So you get a middleman who comes and brings together all these small-scale farmers and then sells either these avocados to a third country, or let's now imagine this example of value creation, whereby the middleman will accumulate all the avocados, then sell to an industry that makes avocado oil. Then the avocado oil is branded, marketed, it's then placed on shelves. You can see this chain all in the middle. So you need the farmer, you need the middleman, you need the industry. direct chain. In between, you also need this cold solutions, so a cold food truck to transport these goods. You need a marketing and branding agency. You need the actual supermarkets or the actual market where you'll be selling these goods and services. So in between the avocado farm and the avocado oil being placed on the market, there are so many stakeholders who now have jobs simply because you've created value. Convert this to the example where you just export. If you just export, you just need the farmer, of course, the middleman who deals with the exportation, and that's it. So the value that is going to come to the economy is much less because no jobs are created. You export the raw material, and then eventually you now come and buy the avocados. But like I'm saying, this idea of comparative advantage sometimes is very simplistic and idealistic. Why? Because it implies to many people, and the context is quite different for us in Africa, that we can openly choose which areas we have a comparative advantage in and then specialize in that area and export finished goods or near complete goods from that area. But the reality is, and if you put on modeled to be an exporter of raw materials. So it takes a much harder task for you now to convert yourself from an exporter of raw materials to become more industrialized, because typically the arrangement that was left is that Africa will be that raw material hub. And that's why if you look at very many economies, they were built around just exporting raw materials, which would then be converted into a value-added good or service, mostly goods, and trying as much as possible to determine what you're most efficient in producing or exporting. So I have to admit, it's rather simplistic and idealistic for me to be telling you Africa, some even from West Africa that you're familiar with. Kenya is one of the major exporters of tea. But don't be mistaken and think that it exports and has its brand sitting in Europe. It exports and then value is added in Europe, value is added in Pakistan, value is added in these other markets. And it's then traded. Consider the idea of comparative advantage, which is not a bad idea and would work, doesn't always necessarily work because the way the configuration was done from the beginning was not one where our economies were industrialized. So it will take a bit much more for us to industrialize such that we add value before exporting. Now, let's consider this idea of industrialization, which I promised to come back to. This industrialization and adding value, and here I want to also, I think an expectation from those in the room will be a discussion on the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA. So this industrialization, as it's developed over time, so initially countries sometimes or attempted to go at it alone, and with time, and value creation and value chains, especially global value chains, are talked about. The most we'll consider some of the considerations there. So with industrialization, what we've seen will be determined by many factors. And one of the factors, which of course can come to mind very easily for everyone in the room, is cheap labor. There are many other factors that, of course, determine where you'll source your raw materials, where you'll source in considering this idea of exporting more than we import, or exporting goods in which we have a better comparative advantage in, or we have more efficiency in producing, some of industry in Africa, some of the most vibrant economies are in the north of Africa in terms of the automotive industry. So here I'm thinking Morocco, I'm thinking Algeria, I'm thinking Tunisia. And some of the luxury brands, if I can call them luxury brands around the world, have or source their components for these automotive industries from these countries in Africa. So here, if you think about Mercedes, if you think about Volkswagen, if you think about Audi, these brands have their components sometimes manufactured in Tunisia, in Morocco, in Algeria, and then exported to Europe. So why is it that this relationship exists? And can a country, for example, is cheap labor. So because of cheap labor, it makes much more sense for these components to be manufactured in Africa and then exported. So may not be necessarily true for Namibia as it is Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. Proximity. If you consider the proximity between Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, and the amount of time it takes between exporting goods from North Africa to Europe, who are neighbors, by the way, as you're aware, it takes a much less period as compared to if Namibia, for example, was to plug into this relationship, or Kenya, or a Southern African country, or East African country. So I'm telling you this to demonstrate to you that it might be easy to talk about comparative advantage and industrialization, but there are factors beyond a country's control that would affect which areas it decides to specialize. So trade policymakers sit and design policy around these considerations, around making it possible for economies to specialize and export in areas where they're much more efficient and have a comparative advantage, and import from the rest. And so this includes seeking a bilateral relationship with other economies, seeking multilateral relationships with other economies, just to improve trade relations and ensure that, for example, the goods that they decide to specialize in get favorable rates or tariffs in other markets, and this is reciprocated. So you can see why this is important for trade policymakers. That, for example, a West African policymaker concerned with cocoa or concerned with fabric will look for markets where cocoa or fabric is able to be marketed, and seek favorable exchange of ties, trade ties, and trade relationships And that's how really trade grows. So you might be wondering to yourself, hey, yeah, it makes sense for trade policymakers. It makes sense for people who are in the manufacturing industry. Why this is important for them? Why being able to find a market for your finished goods or to find a market for your raw materials is important. But why is that important for me who I just shop or I'm not interested in industrialization or this has nothing to do with me? But that's where you go wrong. It has everything to do with you. So whether you participate consciously or not, you are always participating in a trade relationship. The minute you go to a supermarket to purchase a good, the minute you go to a professional to purchase a service, you are participating in a trade relationship. And it doesn't matter whether you do it consciously or unconsciously, this relationship exists. And we've seen this affecting us quite a bit in our lives today. From 2020 to 2022, round about COVID-19.
2000
I think
pendant
this is a
2020,
very rational
2022.
example about trade and how it affects our lives. If you recall very
Il
well,
s'agit de
when
commerce et comment est-ce
COVID-19
qu'il impacte nos vies. Quand on se
struck
rappelle de la
and
COVID,
later escalated to the point of the World Health Organization pronouncing
a,
it as a pandemic,
a
countries
commencé,
were very quick to react to this pronouncement. And I know when we think about COVID-19, one of the immediate places our minds go to is vaccines, PPE, the health side, really, about thinking about combating the disease and protective equipment, vaccines, and so on. But if you recall, in each of the countries we all come from today, and from some of the news we saw then, COVID-19 it was beyond this. It was beyond protective equipment or vaccines. One of the knee-jerk reactions that countries had, but even, maybe let me start from countries and I go to individuals. But one of the knee-jerk reactions countries had is first to stop exportation of food. And the reasoning here was, if we're in a crisis, we're in a pandemic, we need our people to be able to have food. So we're going to impose restrictions on the exportation of food. But not just food, but other essential goods. This idea of let's protect ourselves first. And I don't know if any of you finds this idea ridiculous, but if you introspect, we saw this happening in our own homes, or even if not our own homes, maybe your neighbor. I think we're good people in the room, so maybe your neighbor. I mean, you saw videos of people rushing to supermarkets and hoarding tissue paper, or people rushing and hoarding other items. And sometimes you wonder, what's the sense in all of this? And I'm just using this example to just show you how trade is intricately linked in our lives. So whereas it was a health crisis, people were rushing to ensure that they have sustainability in everything but health. So for example, rushing to buy food, rushing to buy essential items, including tissue paper, and countries. So you can see that from an individualistic point of view. You can see countries hoarding or protecting their economies by imposing restrictions on the exportation of essential goods. But very quickly, because of how the world is currently structured, countries realized that this is hurting each other. So for example, because of the interconnectivity of the world today, the imposition of a restriction in one economy could easily affect the other economy. Because remember, I've told you about this growth of value chains and how sometimes production may not necessarily be located in the same place as the location of the raw materials and could be located in multiple jurisdictions. So if you decide, for example, that you're going to hoard an essential good, that essential good has the possibility of being converted or value added in a different jurisdiction. And so, whereas sometimes you use it as a finished good and in another economy it's used as a value to add value and export, you can see why this interconnectivity would be affected, or this value chain would be affected by the imposition of a restriction in one or more jurisdictions. So it has the domino effect that what happens in one economy can easily affect everyone else. So if you think about it, even in our own, and a very simplistic example, if you think about it in our own, and I'll give you a very simplistic example, in our own individual lives, if you go to the supermarket and you buy, for example, all the sugar and hoard all the sugar, you can see why that will affect your neighbor, because, for example, you rely on your neighbor for a different good or for a different service. And so if they're not able to give you this good or service because you're holding on to one good, you can see how they're affected, and so you're affected. So with time, our value chains have become interconnected, so much so that what happens in one jurisdiction affects what's happening in another jurisdiction. And we saw this practically with COVID-19, with the essential goods. But as Africa, we also saw this particularly with vaccines and with PPE and the hoarding or the restrictions that were placed on PPE and on vaccines, and how this affected the situation in Africa. So this is about trade. Why is it about trade? Because the actions or inaction by one jurisdiction can lead to consequences in a different jurisdiction. I'll give you another practical example of this. Another buzzword in our lives today is climate change, climate action. When you consider climate change and climate action and ask yourself, how did we get here? We got here through trade. So we got here through heavy industrialization through coal-intensive industries, of course, most of them located in the global north. That's just one of the ways we got here. And I usually tend to think alongside some others, the way we'll get out of this is the same way we got in, through trade. But if you think about that, we should do away with these industries or with industrialization completely. Not quite, because as you can imagine, we still rely on some of these industries for our day-to-day lives. We still rely on the existence of this industry of a few, like for example, in the global north, affect the entire world. So you see why trade affects someone sitting in Namibia or Nigeria or Cote d'Ivoire, despite these economies in Nigeria or in Egypt. Why? Because as you know, in some of these economies, especially if you consider DRC, for example, and some of its natural resources, and here I'm not thinking about the controversial ones. I'm thinking more about its environment and its contribution, and the fact that it's not heavily industrialized. And if you can extrapolate this thinking to other, so I'm told I have, oh, sorry. Oh, yes, it is. 14 minutes. Yes. Sorry, I didn't realize it's 14 to the end of the hour. I'll manage my time better. So you can think about other economies, for example, Brazil and its rainforest. And if you think about this discussion on climate change, climate action, you can see why a country that threatens to interfere with its natural resources in the form of a rainforest, for example, can affect all other countries. So, for example, if Brazil decides, yeah, let's get rid of the Amazon, or if DRC decides, let's get rid of all our forests. Of course, these are radical thoughts, but you can see why this would significantly affect all its neighbors, and not just the neighbors, but the world in its entirety. So the interconnectedness between industrialization, between the policies that we make, even if they're not directly related to trade, all should converge at how trade policy affects even non-policymakers, because we got here through trade, ladies and gentlemen. Let me just give you two more examples and then I'll conclude. I think to myself, and this is an example Nigeria can relate to, I don't know if it's as much as a problem there as it is in East Africa. Tax. And particularly, here I want to give you the example of digital services tax. So digital services tax follows the idea of the traditional tax principle being PE, permanent establishment, that you're going to, so economies or jurisdictions are going to tax brick and mortar industries in their jurisdictions. So if you have an industry, if you have a company, and you've established yourself in a jurisdiction, the traditional tax principle of permanent establishment was that that's how that company, that industry will be taxed, because it's brick and mortar, it has physical presence. But with the globalization and digitalization of the world, we now know of companies that are able to extract revenue from jurisdictions without having any physical presence whatsoever. So here I think of an example of Google. So Google has, of course, the web page or web service Google. It has YouTube. It's able to extract revenue from jurisdictions without even setting foot in those jurisdictions. The same reasoning applies to some of these applications that we use, Netflix, Spotify, and so on. So governments around the world being wary of this revenue extraction, which doesn't go to governments. And you know, one of the primary goals of governments is to extract as much revenue from those within its jurisdiction. So you can see why this is a huge problem for governments. So they come up with, some governments come up with this digital services tax. And the idea behind this digital services tax is we are going to tax those entities offering digital services which do not have a permanent establishment in our jurisdiction. Why? Because of this permanent establishment idea, we cannot tax them if they don't have a physical presence. So we have to find a way to tax them. So hence DST, which is controversial, but I don't have time to get into the controversies behind DST. But the reason why I'm bringing this up and why it's intricately linked to our lives today, and this is why trade should matter even for non-policy makers. If I'm a creative, for example, and I have music, I need to be worried about whether Spotify is able to offer its services in our jurisdiction or not. Why? Because governments are increasingly finding creative ways of levying taxes on these market players who have no physical presence. So, for example, there are some jurisdictions that impose value-added tax and digital services tax. What that does, of course, is it increases the cost of participation in this marketplace. So currently there are no, or at least I'm not aware of any data where digital market players have pulled out of a market because of these taxes, VAT and DST. But big economies have been complaining about the imposition of DST. And here I'm thinking about the US. So one of the biggest complaints out of the US is that it's US companies being targeted by this digital services tax. In fact, that's one of the biggest challenges that Trump is putting forward, that you need to eradicate or remove this digital services tax because it's targeting US companies. And you can see why one would think it's US companies being taxed. And the reason why I'm bringing this as a trade issue is quite simple. Two reasons here. First, it sometimes affects whether a market player will enter your market or not, depending on which conditions are available for them in that market. Second, if, for example, I think of myself, or I'm a creative, I write and compose songs, or I'm a singer, or even, for example, I'm an actor, I should be worried about which platforms are available for my shows, music to be consumed by the general public. So I may have nothing to do, in my view, with trade policy, but you can see how I'm being affected because the availability of my show in the market is restricted by the policies the government has put in place. Anyway, I think I've been able to answer the three questions, or I hope I've been able to answer the three questions. I think this is a very good point for me to stop and hand over back to the moderator. I hope it has been a thought-provoking session.
Thank you so very much. This was quite impactful. Wow, that was enlightening for real. I would have to just go over a couple of things. I know we do not have much time. A few key insights that stand out from the conversation. For me, I took down some notes. First is the idea of value creation and value addition. Sustainable economic growth, of course, goes beyond extraction. Raw materials extraction. It depends on transformation. So when value is added to what is produced locally, jobs are created, just like Mishael said, industries expand and societies experience measurable development. Secondly, the discussion on comparative advantage, offered a practical lens, while I was listening to him for rethinking Africa's place in global trade. So each country on the continent possesses distinct strengths that can be strategically developed. Of course, in Nigeria here we have all the natural resources, vast natural resources. So by focusing on sectors where such advantages exist, African economies can enhance productivity, improve competitiveness, and reduce overdependence on imports or low-value exports, which is often the case. Then another striking point I took note of is the reminder that Africa's initial economic design was largely constructed to serve external interests, of course. The continent was positioned primarily as a supplier of raw materials, to Europe, and, the Francophone countries, of course. So without corresponding structures for industrialization or domestic value retention. The reality requires a major structural and policy shift, which is a deliberate transition from exporting raw materials to exporting finished or near finished goods, just like Misha said. This transformation depends on industrialization, innovation, and regional cooperation. So the message is clear. Africa's growth depends on its ability to create and retain value within its borders, guided by comparative advantage and supported by inclusive industrial development policies. And importantly, before I go to the questions, this trade policy conversation is not a remote one. Everyone is part of it, consciously or otherwise. Directly or indirectly, because trade policy affects our livelihoods, it affects opportunities and a broader direction of Africa's development. So it's worth noting that, during the last words of Mishael, where he mentioned the stages of production, of course, may, include different jurisdictions, services, trade goods and services, may often take place in different jurisdictions. So the actions or inactions of one country's trade policy can have a domino effect across others too. So this interconnectedness, makes trade policy not just a technical concern, but a shared responsibility across the countries. So once again, thank you so very much, Mr. Mishael. Thank you. We'll now proceed to a few questions for further reflection. I don't know if you're ready to take the questions. I just have 3 questions for you, please. Confirm you're ready, please. Thank you so much. All right. Thank you. So the first question now is about we are going beyond tariffs and borders. So trade today, just like you already have said, goes beyond customs and tariffs. It's about digital standards. Conversations, these businesses, this space is meaningful.
Sorry, you broke off there. How can?
Okay, I said, that how can young Africans and small businesses, startup businesses, start engaging in these spaces meaningfully? Because of course we have already established that trade goes beyond tariffs and and customs is about digital standards, value chains, and fair competition. That's the first question. Then I don't know if I can go on with the second question, so you can take them all then and answer. Okay, thank you so very much. I'm so sorry I talk very fast for the interpreter. I'm so sorry. Second question here, has to do with infrastructure challenge, and that's a problem in Africa. We all know that. So agreements are one thing. Having all these treaties and all of that, the organization is one thing, but without proper infrastructure, without proper ports, roads, and border systems, trade becomes a theory. So, what creative, practical solutions have you seen that help bridge this infrastructure policy gap? More like a comparative analysis of other jurisdictions vis-a-vis Africa. I don't know. So then, I don't know if you got a question, please. Oh, thank you. Then the last question is, regional trade, of course, will thrive only when African businesses trade more with one another. You've already talked about it. So what needs to change in policy or is in mindset for the private sector to become a real driver of African trade? Because I don't think we're there yet. Thank you so very much.
Okay. Arguably, I think all these questions are interlinked, and I'll tell you why. I didn't talk much about the AfCFTA, but let me tell you a bit about the AfCFTA, and I hope I don't put off a candle in your eyes regarding the AfCFTA, because I'm a bit of a skeptic. I'll be honest about the AfCFTA, and I'll tell you why. And I'll try and answer as quickly as possible. So, first, let me demystify the idea of free trade. The World Trade Organization does not concern itself with free trade. In fact, so this is a common misconception that the World Trade Organization is concerned itself with free trade. If you look at the preamble of the WTO agreement, I think at Recital 3, and you look at Article 3, nowhere does it mention that it's concerned with free trade. If anything, it's more concerned with the liberalization of tariffs. However, free trade agreements are concerned with free trade. So elimination of duties and tariffs as much as possible. But ladies and gentlemen, I want to, because I was told this is a thought-provoking session, I want to just provoke your minds just a bit and for us to be a bit more critical about the AfCFTA and its promise. Because I've seen a lot said about the AfCFTA, how innovative it is, how much of a game changer it is. And to be honest, as you've heard, my work really does revolve around the AfCFTA quite a bit. But the reason why I want you to think about it just a bit more critically is because I don't think the AfCFTA offers Africa something that was completely non-existent before. What do I mean by this? The AfCFTA is often considered as a WTO plus document, meaning the commitments that African countries have already given and adding more commitments to mean African countries agreed to open their marketplaces up to a certain extent, and therefore, given the extent that they agreed to open their marketplaces, the AfCFTA is more liberalization to this. The reason why I don't think of it as much as a game changer as sometimes it's marketed to be is because there was the opportunity to export to other African markets before the AfCFTA. It's not as though the AfCFTA has created this opportunity. So, for example, Kenyans could trade with Tanzanians. Tanzanians could trade with South Africans on two bases. One is the regional economic communities, of which each of our countries that we come from here today, there's a regional economic community we belong to. The other is the WTO agreements. So if you think about it, there have always been opportunities for trade, given the different configurations that exist. Was trade happening? And especially in a significant volume. So, for example, I know in the East African market in ECOWAS, there is some trade. But are the big trade markets intra-African trade? So I want you to sometimes ask yourself, is the AfCFTA going to change this? Because my answer for you is no. If an exporter, for example, was not exporting to West Africa, it's not the AfCFTA that is going to make them export to West Africa, because this opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, existed. The same way it existed to export to Uganda, the same way it existed to export to South Africa. to me, there's nothing in the AfCFTA agreement that's the biggest game changer, as sometimes it's marketed to be. Or I see some statistics being given, 1.3 billion. These are numbers you see quite often. And I'll tell you why I'm a bit of a skeptic in this regard. And I think my answer will answer these three questions. So I'll start with the second question on infrastructure and creative solutions. One of the reasons why I think some of the intra-African trade is not at the level we'd expect it to be, of course, is lack of infrastructure. Also, let me just demystify just one idea here very quickly. I know I don't have time, but I'll be as quick as possible. I also often see people complain about how expensive it is to travel within Africa. I also have some reservations about this complaint, quite simply, because if you think about business and their business is structured, if there are no volumes of, for example, Kenyans going to Nigeria, there may be no reason, for example, to have 3 daily flights from Kenya to Nigeria, or 3 direct daily flights from Kenya to Nigeria. So I think we sometimes forget, and so we don't have enough numbers about the volumes. How many Tanzanians are traveling to Morocco daily for us to have a daily flight to Morocco, or 3 daily flights to Morocco? And why sometimes is it a business sense for someone traveling to Morocco to first go to Europe, then to Morocco? Sometimes it's a business decision based off volumes. And will the AfCFTA change this? Ladies and gentlemen, I don't think the AfCFTA will increase the volumes of Tanzanians going to Morocco, if you really think about it. So some of these problems, for example, infrastructure, are to be solved by governments. It's governments to build this infrastructure. Private sector can try as much as possible, but the most private sector can do is public-private partnerships, which can only go so far. If it's difficult, for example, for goods to be exchanged between South Africa and Egypt, or South Africa and Ghana, because of the amount of time it takes, and there being already established trade routes, then path dependency will follow. Path dependency meaning there's already a path that has been created. This path has lasted for the last 30 years. Why will this be interrupted because of a free trade agreement? I don't know if you're following my reasoning here. So this is certainly the practical solutions really involves a lot of investment by government to make some of this trade possible. So even the private sector participation, in my line of work, I've come across companies that are already exporting to West Africa. And they were exporting before the AfCFTA, and they'll continue exporting with or without the AfCFTA. Why? It made business sense. So at the end of the day, it's really a question about business sense. Does it make business sense to make these exports? What's the turnaround time? What's the volume in the market? So this is what businesses consider before they can export. Practical questions. They don't consider some of the marketing. I'm sorry to say that I often see 1.3 billion. Where is the 1.3 billion? If today, I for example, if you think about the different products that you have in each of these countries, if a manufacturer wants to export those products, where is this market practically? Is it really there? Is there really a market for Ghanaian kente in Kenya? Or is Ghanaian kente more marketable in other jurisdictions? That's why, for example, if you think about some of the things Kenya exports and looks to Europe or the US, it's because the market is there. I don't know how much market, it's sometimes more because the market exists in those jurisdictions than there has been no agreement. Because Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Burundi, Rwanda, Somalia, South Sudan, and the East African community. So, and in fact, it's a customs union, a higher level of integration than the AfCFTA. So why doesn't it export to these markets despite the agreement? So if you think about the AfCFTA from this point of view, unless there are other factors that make business sense for businesses, it will not be of any use. It will just be like our own regional economic communities. So I think with that, I've answered the second and third question. The last question is the first one. Trade goes beyond tariffs. How to start engaging in this space meaningfully. I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I should clarify this. I do think there's still a high level of intra-African trade and integration that can take place. But for this to happen, I think we need to engage more meaningfully and more truthfully amongst ourselves. Trade, I mean, it's a business decision. I'll just go back to that. Trade is a business decision. And I don't think any of you are surprised by this. If you consider what you're going to buy in a market today as an individual, you consider that based off your interest, based off your pocket, and so on. So all this to just tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that we need to think about some of these aspects more critically and engage with them more meaningfully, rather than just throwing around numbers without more thought process going into it. I thank you for your time.
Thank you so very much. Thank you, Mishael. Thank you. Thank you. That was very, very deep. Thank you for the analysis. Thank you. We deeply appreciate the time you spent with us, and it's been enlightening. Professor Babatini, we are so sorry for keeping you waiting, sir. We are so sorry. We'll proceed now to the masterclass session. Professor Sir,